The hatchling bit him on the second day. Cale Martin had been at Outpost Vera for 41 hours, still carrying the smell of the shuttle that had dropped him on the colony's eastern ridge, when the smallest of the 4 ridge-crest hatchlings sank a row of needle teeth into the meat of his left forearm. He didn't yank back, didn't shout. He sat on the cold stone floor of the pen enclosure, looked the hatchling in its amber eyes, and said, "All right, little one. You let me know when you're done." The hatchling held on for 9 seconds. Then it released, licked the wound once with a forked black tongue, and settled into his lap like it had been sleeping there for years. Behind the observation glass, Warden Soreth's crest plates flattened against his skull. The Veshan officer had overseen the beast pens for 11 rotations. He had seen ridge crests shatter reinforced containment doors, gut a handler through 3 layers of ballistic mesh, and send a full security detail running with a single territorial shriek. He had never, in all those rotations, seen one choose to sit in a person's lap. "Get the recorder," he said to his adjutant. His voice was quieter than he wanted it to be. Cale didn't know anyone was watching. He was too busy pressing a torn strip from the hem of his work shirt against the bite on his arm, while the hatchling pushed its snout under his chin, making a sound like gravel turning in a low drum. The other 3 hatchlings hadn't moved from their corner of the pen. Their dorsal spines, each one a thin blade of pale blue cartilage that would, in adult ridge crests, harden into a serrated crest capable of shearing through ship plating, flickered with faint bioluminescent pulses. They watched. He had arrived the previous morning, a 22-year-old with a duffel, a transfer order, and no particular reputation. The shuttle pilot had called him the replacement, the same way someone might say the spare part. Outpost Vera was a research and containment station built into the basalt spine of the Tyvek Ridge on Karath Roman 4, a colony world the Galactic Accord had classified as a Category 3 predator zone. The ridge crests were the reason for the classification. They were the apex of the apex 900-kilogram reptilian predators with reinforced bone plating along their skulls, a double row of serrated dorsal spines, and a hunting intelligence that made the Veshan biologists uncomfortable. They coordinated. They remembered faces. They held grudges across breeding cycles. The adults were housed in reinforced enclosures carved into the ridge itself, separated by 3-meter walls of fused basalt and monitored by tremor sensors, acoustic arrays, and a rotating staff of 12 handlers, all Veshan, all trained, all armed. The hatchlings occupied a smaller pen near the main lab complex, considered lower risk because of their size. An adult ridge crest stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder. The hatchlings were the size of large dogs, still soft-scaled, still clumsy, still dangerous enough to take a hand off if you weren't paying attention. Cale's transfer order said Beast Pen Auxiliary Hatchling Division. It was the lowest posting at the outpost. The last 3 holders of the position had requested reassignment within their first cycle. The one before them had been medevaced after a hatchling opened his thigh to the bone. Nobody had told Cale any of this before he arrived. The personnel clerk, a narrow-faced Veshan named Droost, had handed him a keycard, a schedule, and a look that suggested he was already composing the incident report. "The hatchlings are fed at 3rd bell and 9th bell," Droost had said. "Nutrient slurry, pre-portioned, don't deviate. Don't touch them with bare hands. Don't make sudden movements. Don't turn your back. Don't enter alone." Cale had entered alone on day 2 because the assigned handler, a Veshan named Torek, hadn't shown up. Torek, he would learn later, had been nursing a fractured wrist from a hatchling strike the previous week, and had decided that a missed shift was preferable to losing the other hand. No one had informed Cale of this. No one had informed Cale of most things. So he'd walked into the pen enclosure with the nutrient trays, set them down in the feeding ring, and sat on the floor 3 meters away, the way his mother had taught him to sit with skittish livestock on the Terra Nova homestead where he'd grown up. Quiet, low, smaller than the animal, patient. The hatchlings had watched him for 20 minutes before the smallest one crossed the floor. That was when it bit him. And that was when it chose him. Warden Sareth reviewed the recorder footage 4 times that evening. The hatchling designation RC7, the run of the clutch, the one that had injured 2 handlers and refused nutrient slurry for 3 consecutive feedings, was curled against the human's chest, dorsal spine's flat respiratory rate at resting baseline. The biometric overlay showed something Sareth had never seen in a juvenile ridge-crest, a sustained calm state neurochemical signature. Not drugged, not exhausted, calm. He called a staff meeting. 12 handlers, 2 biologists, the personnel clerk. "The human stays in the hatchling pen," he said. "Extended observation protocol. I want continuous monitoring." Senior handler Vethais, a broad-shouldered Veshan who had been working with ridge-crest since before the outpost was built, leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "One contact event doesn't mean anything, Warden. The runt latched onto a warm body. It'll lose interest." "RC7 hasn't latched onto anything in 11 weeks, Sareth said. "It has actively rejected every handler we've assigned. It bit through Torik's wrist guard. It cornered Dren against the pen wall for 40 minutes until we could extract her. And today it climbed into a human's lap and fell asleep." Vethais's mouth thinned. "Respectfully, Warden, he's a replacement, a human replacement at that. He has no beast handling certification, no predator contact training, no. He has the only calm ridge-crest hatchling on this station. That's his certification." The room went quiet. Sareth's crest plates had risen, which among the Veshan was the equivalent of a human baring teeth. No one argued further. Kale wasn't told about the meeting. He was told to report to the hatchling pen at first bell the following morning, same as before. He did. RC7 was waiting at the pen gate when he arrived. Not at the feeding ring. Not in the corner with the other 3. At the gate, pressed against the reinforced mesh, dorsal spines pulsing a slow blue rhythm that Kale had already started thinking of as its version of a purr. He opened the gate. The hatchling pushed through before it was fully open and pressed its head against his knee. Kale crouched and put a hand on the bony ridge above its eyes, the place where the skull plating was thinnest and the scales were still soft. "Morning," he said. The hatchling made the gravel drum sound and leaned into his hand with its full body weight, which was already more than it should have been for a runt. Kale braced his knee against the floor and held steady. The other 3 hatchlings had shifted in their corner, not approaching, but their heads were turned, their spines pulsing in the slow rhythm Kale had started to associate with attention. Interest. They were watching what RC7 was doing, and they were learning from it. This was the thing about ridge-crests that the handler manuals didn't cover and the biologists were only beginning to understand. The clutch was not 4 separate animals. It was a collective. What one learned, the others absorbed. What one decided, the others weighed. And what one trusted, the others would test. Behind the observation glass, Dr. Saith, the station's lead xenobiologist, a slight Veshan with mandibles that clicked like a teletype when she was excited, was already recording. She had been monitoring the hatchling pen for 9 weeks, through 7 handlers, through 3 injuries, through the slow deterioration of a clutch that had refused every form of social contact the station could offer. She had written, in her private notes 2 weeks ago, that the clutch was heading toward a behavioral spiral that would end in euthanasia within 6 months. And now the runt was pressing its head against a human's hand like it had been born there. "Pair-bonding behavior," she said to her assistant, not looking away from the enclosure. "Pre-imprint chemical markers. Look at the cortisol drop. It fell off a cliff the moment he touched the skull ridge. The hatchling is treating the human as a clutch anchor." "That's impossible," the assistant said. "Ridge-crests don't bond outside their species." "The literature is clear. The literature is based on observation of ridge-crests in proximity to Veshan handlers who enter the pen wearing 3 layers of ballistic protection and carrying shock prods. Saith's mandibles clicked. Nobody has ever sat on the floor and let one bite them. Perhaps the literature is incomplete. The assistant opened his mouth, then closed it. On the other side of the glass, RC7 had climbed into Kale's lap and was pushing its snout against the underside of his jaw, the same position a ridge-crest cub occupied when nursing from its mother. Kale had one hand on the hatchling's back, between the dorsal spines, and was talking in a low, steady voice about the temperature of morning air on Terra Nova and how it smelled like wet iron after a storm. "Note the tense," Saith said, almost to herself. "They didn't bond outside their species." On day 3, Kale brought a rough-textured cleaning cloth from the supply room, industrial grade, meant for scrubbing pen walls. He folded it into a pad and ran it gently along RC7's jaw and down the side of its neck, where the soft juvenile scales met the harder plates. The hatchling went rigid for 2 seconds. Then every spine on its back went flat, its eyes half closed, and it pushed into the cloth so hard it nearly knocked him sideways. Behind the glass, Saith pulled up a biochemical readout. "He's simulating social grooming. Look at the oxytocin analog spike. That's a bonding hormone we only see during maternal nursing. He just triggered it with a cleaning rag." When Kale groomed the other hatchlings over the next 2 days slowly, one at a time, the effect was the same. Each one, rigid, then relaxed, then pushing into the contact. The grooming built trust at the level of the body. The hatchlings let him touch the places they didn't let anyone touch: the soft undersides of their jaws, the thin-scaled patches behind their forelimbs, the base of their dorsal spines where the nerve clusters were densest. On day 4, the second hatchling crossed the floor. RC12, the largest of the clutch, a dark-scaled juvenile with the early signs of the reinforced skull plating that would make it a dominant specimen in adulthood, walked to where Kale was sitting with RC7 and stood over him. It lowered its head until its snout was level with his face. Its breath was hot and smelled like iron. Its eyes were the color of burnt copper. Kale held still. He understood in the wordless way he'd always understood animals that this was a test. Not from RC12, from the clutch. RC12 was asking the question the others needed answered. Was this human pack or was he food? He lifted his hand slowly and placed it flat against the underside of RC12's jaw, where the scales were softest, where a ridge-crest would never allow a threat to touch. "Easy," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." RC12 exhaled, a long, slow breath that fogged in the cool air of the pen. Then it folded its legs beneath it and laid its head on Kale's thigh, next to RC7. Behind the observation glass, Saith said a word in Old Veshan that her assistant didn't recognize. On day 5, RC9 crossed. It circled Kale 3 times before settling against his back, pressing its flank against his spine, its head turned to watch the pen door. A sentry by nature, and it had chosen its post, between Kale and the entrance. On day 6, RC14, the last holdout stood up, crossed the pen floor in 4 measured strides, and lay down across Kale's feet. It didn't look at him. It simply placed its body between his feet and the floor, and the message was clear. "You are not leaving this pen without stepping over me, and you will not step over me." By the end of the first week, all 4 hatchlings slept in a pile around Kale during his shifts. They followed him to the feeding ring, to the cleaning station, to the door when he left at end of shift, pressing their snouts against the mesh and making the gravel drum sound until he was out of sight. The tremor sensors registered no stress signatures during his shifts. The acoustic arrays picked up nothing but the low, rhythmic vibration the hatchlings made when they were in physical contact with him. The other handlers noticed. Hard not to. Torek came to the observation glass on day 8, wrist still in a brace, and watched Kale sit on the floor while RC7, the hatchling that had fractured his wrist, climbed onto the human's shoulder and draped itself around his neck like a scarf. Torek stood there for a long time. Then he turned and walked to the mess hall and didn't say anything to anyone for the rest of the shift. Handler Dren came on day 10. She watched the human hand feed RC-12, holding a strip of nutrient gel between his fingers, while the hatchling's jaws that could dent reinforced mesh, closed around it with a precision so delicate that Kale's skin wasn't even reddened. How, Dren said. I've been asking that for 8 days, Sayeth said. He's sitting on the floor and talking about weather on his homeworld. That's it. That's the technique. Warden Sarath received the weekly behavioral report from Dr. Sayeth. It was 3 pages longer than any previous report. The summary line read, "Recommend reclassifying auxiliary Marden as primary hatchling handler. The clutch has bonded. Separating the human now would cause acute distress and potential regression to aggressive baseline." Sarath approved the reclassification. He transmitted it to the personnel system and watched the designation change on Kale's file, from auxiliary to primary, from expendable to essential, from the spare part to the only part that worked. Vethai signed the acknowledgement form without comment. A human, 22, no training, primary handler for the only viable ridge-crest clutch the station had produced in 3 breeding cycles. For the record, Vethai said, I still believe this is a temporary behavioral anomaly. When the novelty wears off, the clutch will revert to baseline, and you'll need a trained handler to manage the fallout. Noted, Sarath said. Vethai's left the office. Sarath waited until the door closed, then turned to Sayeth, who had been standing in the corner with her data slate. Will they revert? No, the neurochemical profiles show progressive deepening, not plateau. This bond is strengthening every day. If anything, separating them now would be more dangerous than it was a week ago. She paused. Vethais isn't wrong to be concerned. He's wrong about the direction. The risk isn't that the bond will break. The risk is that it's becoming so deep that disrupting it would be catastrophic. The hatchlings didn't bite anyone else. Not Sayeth, who came into the pen to check her instruments with increasing frequency. Not Sarath, who stood at the gate during morning inspections and found the hatchlings watching him with calm interest instead of cornered hostility. Not even Droost, who delivered a replacement keycard one afternoon and stood in the pen doorway for 30 seconds with his mouth open, while RC-14 sniffed his ankle, apparently satisfied that the personnel clerk was boring but not dangerous. Kale started calling them names, against protocol. He told RC-77 that it had the worst table manners he'd ever seen in a predator, and RC-12 boss that it was getting too big to sit on his feet but could try if it wanted. He talked low and steady about nothing. The weather on Terra Nova. The grain fields at harvest. The sound of rain on the steel roof of the livestock barn. They listened with their whole bodies, spines oriented toward his voice, eyes half closed, breathing synchronized. Sayeth's instruments showed their neurochemical signatures flatten into a state she described as unprecedented affiliative calm. He's not training them, she told Sarath during a daily briefing. He's not using any recognized technique. He's just present, and they've decided he's theirs. Theirs. The bond is bidirectional, Warden, but the clutch initiated it. They chose him. In ridge-crest social dynamics, that's a claim, a permanent one. In the second week, the formation started. Kale noticed it first during feeding time. When he walked from the gate to the feeding ring, Boss walked at the front, 2 steps ahead. RC-9 and RC-14 flanked at his sides, precise, shoulder height to his hip. 7 rode his shoulder or stayed tight behind Boss's right flank. They moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, turned when he turned. He mentioned it to Sayeth. She went very still. Show me, she said. He walked the length of the pen. The hatchlings fell in, Boss forward, flankers tight, 7 on his shoulder. They moved as a unit, silent, precise, eyes forward. Sayeth pulled up a holographic recording from 3 years prior, an adult ridge-crest hunting pack, 6 animals, moving through the scrub forest of the Tyvek Ridge. The formation was identical. They're not playing, she said. They're guarding you. This is a protective hunting pack formation. We see it in adults during territorial defense and pack-anchor escort. It has never been documented in juveniles. What does it mean? Sayith's mandibles clicked once. It means they've decided you're worth dying for. In the third week, Kale tripped over a nutrient tray during cleaning and went down hard, his knee striking the stone with a crack that echoed through the enclosure. He hissed through his teeth reflex, not real pain, and before the sound was finished, the hatchlings were on him. Not attacking, covering. Boss planted itself between Kale and the pen door, skull lowered, crest raised. The flankers pressed against him from both sides, spines angled outward. Seven scrambled from its corner and wedged itself under his chin, vibrating with the threat response tone. They thought he was hurt. They thought something in the pen had hurt him, and they had gone, instantly and without hesitation, into a defensive formation around their anchor. It took them 4 minutes to stand down. Boss was the last to lower its crest. It kept one eye on the pen door the entire time. Sayith flagged the incident, spontaneous collective defense response. Response time, sub-second. Coordination, adult level. The fourth week brought the maintenance tech. A Veshan named Gruel was assigned to repair a cracked sensor housing inside the pen during Kale's shift. Large, even for a Veshan, with a tool kit that clinked when he walked. He didn't look at Kale. He didn't look at the hatchlings. He knelt at the sensor housing and started working. Boss's crest plates rose halfway. The flankers shifted position between Kale and the tech. Kale stood slowly. Hey, you might want to keep your movements slow. Gruel glanced over his shoulder. I've got a work order, human, 5 minutes. He reached for a tool and knocked his kit over. The clatter of metal on stone was sudden and sharp. Boss charged. Not a bluff full acceleration, skull lowered, crest raised, the kind of direct assault that an adult ridge-crest used to kill. 12 kilograms of juvenile predator closing 4 meters in less than a second. Kale stepped into its path. He put his hand out, palm flat, and said one word, hold. Boss stopped. Its claws scraped twin furrows in the stone. Its crest was still raised, eyes locked on Gruel, who was pressed flat against the wall with the color drained from his crest. Easy, Kale said. He put his hand on Boss's skull plate between the eyes. He's not a threat, he's fixing a sensor. Boss's crest lowered, one blade at a time, slow, reluctant, but it lowered. Gruel finished in 2 minutes instead of 5. He left through the service access and didn't come back. Behind the observation glass, Vethais had watched the entire incident. The most aggressive juvenile on the station, a specimen that had put 2 handlers in the medical bay, had stopped mid-charge because a human told it to. Sayith, Vethais said, and his voice had a quality she'd never heard before. What would have happened if the human wasn't in the pen? You would have a dead maintenance tech and a clutch tagged for termination. Soreth added a line to the pen's operating procedures that afternoon. No maintenance work inside the hatchling enclosure during pack-anchor shifts without prior coordination through the pack-anchor directly. It was the first time the station had ever adjusted its procedures around a human schedule. A week later, the station's power grid fluctuated during a storm cycle on the ridge. The lights in the hatchling pen cut out for 11 seconds. In that darkness, Kale felt the hatchlings move, not in panic precise. Boss shifted in front of him. The flankers pressed tight against his sides. 7 climbed higher on his shoulder, tense but controlled, and its dorsal spines began to glow. Not the pale blue of contentment or the hot white blue of threat display. A new color, a soft, steady amber, the same shade as the hatchling's eyes. It cast a warm light across the pen, enough to see by, enough to show Kale the 4 small bodies arrayed around him in perfect formation. They were lighting the way for him. In the dark, when they thought he couldn't see, they had become his lantern. The lights came back. Saith replayed the footage 12 times and walked to Sareth's office. The hatchlings produced a light frequency that matches human scotopic vision, our low-light range, not theirs. Ridge-crest visual sensitivity peaks in ultraviolet. The amber frequency is useless to them. It's useful to us. To him, Sareth corrected. To him, they adjusted their bioluminescence to serve his visual needs. In 11 seconds, in the dark, she paused. These animals are adapting to their anchor in real time, not behaviorally, physiologically. If we lose this human, we don't just lose the clutch, we lose data that the entire predator management discipline needs. Sareth nodded. He began drafting a case for the Accord headquarters' special status for the program, protection for the human at its center. He never got to send it before Krev arrived. The trouble came at the start of the 5th week. A delegation arrived from the Galactic Accord's Predator Management Division, 3 officials in pressed uniforms with data slates, and the particular expression of people who believed their authority extended to everything they could see. Their leader was a Veshan named Director Krev, tall, pale-crested, with the kind of voice that filled rooms without rising. Krev reviewed the station's reports in Sareth's office, and his crest plates went flat when he reached Saith's behavioral summary. You've allowed a human to serve as primary handler for a Category 3 Apex clutch, he said. The clutch bonded with him spontaneously, Sareth said. Dr. Saith's data supports. I've read Saith's data. I've also read the Predator Management Code, which specifies that all Category 3 handlers must hold a Level 5 certification minimum. Does the human hold a Level 5? No. Does he hold any certification? No. Then remove him from the pen and assign a certified handler. End of shift tomorrow. Sareth's crest plates rose. Director, the hatchlings have pair bonded. If we remove the human, Saith's models predict acute distress, regression to aggressive baseline, and potential self-harm. We could lose the entire clutch. Then we lose the clutch. Krev set his data slate on the desk. Protocol exists for a reason, Warden. There has never been an interspecies pair bond. There's no protocol to cover it because it's never happened. Then there's no exemption for it either. End of shift tomorrow, that's final. Krev wanted to see the pen for himself. He arrived at the observation corridor an hour later and stood behind the glass. Inside, Kale was sitting on the floor with Seven on his shoulder and Boss at his feet, talking to the hatchlings about thunderstorms on the Terra Nova plains. Krev spoke into the corridor intercom. Human, step to the gate. Kale stood. The hatchling stood with him. He walked to the gate and they followed in formation. Krev looked at RC-7, draped across the human's shoulder, its amber eyes watching the director with the alert disinterest of a predator that had categorized him and found him unimportant. What is your technique for maintaining control of these animals? Kale looked at Seven, at Boss, at the flankers, who had moved closer when the unfamiliar voice came through the intercom and hadn't moved back. I don't control them, he said. They chose to be here, same as I did. Something shifted behind Krev's eyes, the recognition that this human genuinely did not comprehend the chain of command he was violating, and that this incomprehension was not defiance. It was something that didn't have a category in the Predator Management Code. He turned and walked away without another word. Sareth came to tell him that evening. He stood outside the gate and spoke through the mesh, and his voice was the most careful Kale had ever heard it. The Accord delegation has ordered your removal from the hatchling program. Effective end of shift tomorrow. Kale's hand stopped moving on Seven's spine. The hatchling's glow dimmed. What happens to them? Certified handlers will assume care. The certified handlers are the ones they bit. Sareth's crest plates flattened. He didn't have an answer for that. I'm sorry, Martin. Can I have the rest of the shift? Of course. Kale didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't file a complaint or request an appeal. He sat on the pen floor with 4 hatchlings pressed against him and nodded once. Sareth would remember that nod for a long time. It wasn't resignation. It was the nod of a man who understood that some things couldn't be fought from inside the system, and who had decided to do the only thing he could, be present for as long as he was allowed. He spent his last full shift the way he'd spent every other one. He fed them. He cleaned the pen. He sat on the floor and talked. He told Seven about the creek behind his mother's homestead where he used to sit with the draft animals during storms, because they were afraid of thunder and he wasn't, and they seemed to know it. Seven purred against his neck gravel, turning in a low drum, but softer now, thinner, as if the hatchling was trying to be quiet. He told Boss it was getting heavy. Boss pressed its skull plate harder against his leg, and Kale felt the vibration of the big juvenile's purr through his own bones. He told RC9 it had a good pounce. RC9 positioned itself at his right side and didn't move. He told RC14 that its flanking instinct was the sharpest he'd seen, and that any pack would be lucky to have it. RC14 lay across his feet and closed its eyes. He meant all of it. He had been on the station for 5 weeks, and he had said more honest words to these 4 animals than he had said to any person since his mother died. That wasn't self-pity, it was just fact. Some people talk to people. Kale talked to the ones who listened with their whole bodies. When end of shift came, he stood. The hatchlings stood with him. He walked to the gate and they followed in formation. He stopped at the gate and turned around. "I have to go," he said. "You're going to be all right." The hatchlings didn't move. He opened the gate. Seven's claws tightened on his shoulder, pricking through his shirt. Boss pressed its head against his hip. RC9 and RC14 moved closer, closing the formation tight around his legs. He reached up and lifted Seven from his shoulder, gently, supporting its weight with both hands, one under the chest, one under the hindquarters, keeping the dorsal spines flat. Seven's amber eyes were wide. Its spines pulsed once, twice, and went dark. He set it down next to Boss. "Stay here," he said. His voice was steady. His hands weren't. He stepped through the gate and closed it behind him. The click of the magnetic lock was very loud in the silence. 4 hatchlings stood on the other side of the mesh. They didn't make a sound. Their spines were dark, their bodies still, their eyes fixed on the human walking away down the corridor. Then RC12 raised its head and screamed. The sound hit the acoustic arrays at 147 decibels, well above the threshold for an adult distress call, let alone a juvenile's. It bounced off the basalt walls of the pen enclosure and rolled down the corridor like something physical. Maintenance staff 2 levels up felt it in their teeth. RC7 joined, then RC9, then RC14. 4 hatchlings screaming in a synchronized harmonic that Saith, scrambling to her monitoring station in the middle of her sleep cycle, identified as a pattern never previously documented in ridge-crest vocalizations, a pack summons, not a distress call, not a territorial warning, a summons. A demand for the return of something the pack had claimed. Kale was halfway to the barracks when the sound reached him. He stopped in the middle of the corridor, one hand flat against the wall, and closed his eyes. He could feel the vibration through the stone, the 4 voices locked together in a harmonic that he recognized because he'd heard the calm version of it every day for 5 weeks. The gravel drum purr, the pack sound. Except now it was inverted, torn open, turned into something that said, "Come back, come back, come back." He stood there for a long time. Then he opened his eyes and kept walking, and his face was the face of someone who was doing the hardest thing he'd ever done, which was nothing. The screaming lasted 11 hours. It was heard through every level of the station. The mess hall cleared within 10 minutes. The shuttle bay crew, 3 levels up and 200 meters away, could feel it in the deck plating. RC-12 charged the first handler through the gate, driving the armored Veshan backward hard enough to crack the plating on his shoulder guard. The second handler got 3 steps in before RC-9, and RC-14 positioned themselves between him and the feeding ring, synchronized warning growl vibrating the floor. He backed out without being told. RC-7 wedged itself into the corner behind the feeding ring and refused to be approached. Its spines were dark. Its breathing was shallow. It had stopped screaming around the 4th hour, and the silence from the runt was worse than the noise from the others, because silence in RC-7 had always meant it was about to hurt someone. The nutrient trays went untouched. 8 feeding portions rejected. Sayeth's neurochemical monitors showed stress signatures climbing toward levels she'd only seen in ridge-crests during live capture operations. Vethai's tried at the 7th hour. Full protective gear, sedation prod as backup, tone-coded vocalization sequence designed to signal non-threat. He'd used it 1,000 times. He was the best handler on the station. RC-12 didn't charge. It did something worse. It walked to the center of the pen, positioned itself directly between Vethai's and RC-7, and lowered its head until its skull plating was aimed at the handler's chest. It held that position, motionless, for 90 seconds. The meaning was unambiguous. You are not him, and you will not pass. Vethai's left the pen. He removed his protective gear in the corridor, piece by piece, and his hands were not entirely steady. At the 9th hour, Sayeth walked to Krev's quarters herself. Director, RC-7's neurochemical stress markers have reached the threshold that precedes self-injurious behavior in juvenile ridge-crests. If the runt begins self-harming, the other 3 will escalate in sympathy. The protocol calls for remote sedation, which at current stress levels carries a 30% mortality risk per animal. 4 animals. The math is not in your favor. That's a manipulation, Doctor. That's data. You can call it whatever makes you comfortable. But in 2 hours, your protocol is going to kill a viable clutch. Every ridge-crest specialist in the sector will know it was your decision. And every report will note that a simple solution returning the bonded anchor was denied on regulatory grounds. Krev stared at her. Sayeth stared back. She was half his height and a quarter his mass, and she didn't blink. I'll consider it, he said. Consider faster, she said, and left. At dawn, Sareth stood outside the hatchling pen and listened to 4 small predators screaming for a human who wasn't there, and made a decision he would later describe as operationally necessary. He went to Director Krev's quarters and knocked. The clutch is in acute distress. 16 hours without eating. 1 handler injured, 2 more turned back, including my senior handler. If we don't return the human, we lose this clutch. Krev was still in sleep garments. Protocol. Protocol was written for handlers, Director, not for pack anchors. No ridge-crest has ever bonded with a non-Veshian, so no protocol exists. I'm asking for an operational exemption. Denied. Then I'm asking you to come to the pen and make that decision in front of the clutch. Krev's crest plates went flat. I'm not going near. You're ordering the removal of their anchor from 3 corridors away. Come see what that order looks like at the point of contact. Something shifted in his face. Not compassion, calculation. The political math of losing a viable clutch versus bending a regulation. He dressed. They walked. The screaming grew louder with each step, layered, harmonic, a sound that vibrated in the bones. When they reached the observation glass, Krev stopped. 4 hatchlings, spines blazing white-blue, the pen floor gouged where claws had raked the stone. The gate mesh deformed where RC-12 had thrown its weight against it, repeatedly, in the direction the human had walked. 1 acoustic dampener cracked from sustained output. RC-7, the runt, the smallest, was pressed against the gate mesh, still and silent, its spines dark, breathing shallow. It had stopped screaming. It was just waiting, pressed against the last place it had seen him, waiting for him to come back. Krev stared at it for a long time. Behind him, the screaming of the other 3 made the lights flicker. "Get the human," he said. They found Cale in the barracks, sitting on the edge of his bunk, dressed, boots on, duffel packed. He hadn't slept. The bite mark on his arm, the first one, from day 2, was visible below his rolled-up sleeve. A ring of pale dots on tanned skin that had scarred clean and white. When Sarath told him, something moved across his face, relief, maybe, or something too large for that word, and he said, "Let me get the nutrient trays." He walked into the hatchling pen carrying 4 trays of nutrient slurry, and the screaming stopped like someone had thrown a switch. Absolute silence. 4 hatchlings turned toward the gate, spines flickering, bodies locked, and then they moved. 7 hit him first, launching from 3 meters away and landing on his chest with enough force to stagger him. He caught it. Of course he caught it. It wrapped itself around his torso, claws hooked into his shirt, head shoved under his jaw, and made a sound that was not the gravel drum purr. Higher, thinner, keening, a sound Saith would later describe as a juvenile distress relief vocalization with no prior analog in our dataset. Boss pressed against his legs, skull plate against his thigh, pushing hard enough to bruise. RC-9 and RC-14 flanked so tight he could feel their heartbeats through his trousers. Cale stood in the middle of the pen holding a ridge-crest hatchling against his chest, surrounded by 3 more, and said, in a voice that cracked exactly once, "I told you I wasn't going anywhere." Behind the observation glass, Director Krev watched. His crest plates were flat against his skull, his data slate forgotten at his side. Beside him, Sarath stood with arms folded. Saith was recording. Vethais was there too, arms crossed, but his crest plates were half raised, which among the Veshan meant something between admission and awe. The hatchlings ate, all 4 trays clean, for the first time in over a day. Then they arranged themselves around Cale in the protective formation and went to sleep. The pen went quiet. The acoustic arrays registered nothing but the gravel drum purr, steady, synchronized, 4 small heartbeats locked to 1 large one. Krev left the observation window without speaking. His adjutants later reported that he sat in his quarters for 20 minutes before opening his data slate and writing 3 words in his personal log. "I was wrong." He deleted them before saving, but the adjutants had seen, and on a station of 53 personnel, nothing stayed private for long. 2 days later, the crisis came. 7th bell. Cale was in the pen, seated cross-legged on the floor, while Boss chewed on a reinforced enrichment toy and 7 dozed in his lap. The flankers were play wrestling near the cleaning station. Normal, calm, routine. The alarm hit without warning. A deep, oscillating tone Cale had never heard the perimeter breach klaxon. Boss was on its feet instantly, spines raised, head swiveling toward the pen wall that faced the ridge exterior. 7's eyes snapped open, spines blazing white. Cale stood, "Easy, stay here." The comms panel crackled. Sarath's voice stripped of its usual control. "All personnel, containment breach in progress. Enclosure 6, adult female, designation RC Prime. She has broken through the secondary barrier. All handlers to stations. All non-essential personnel, shelter in place." RC Prime, the matriarch, 1,200 kilograms, the largest ridge-crest ever documented at Vera. The mother of the clutch Cale was tending. She had been housed in a deep ridge enclosure rated for twice her mass, behind 3 independent barrier systems. The barriers had held for 9 years. She had just broken through 2 of them in under 4 minutes. Saith was shouting from the lab. "She's been agitated for 3 days. Elevated cortisol, elevated territorial hormones." She heard them. During the screaming, she heard her cubs calling for their anchor, and she's been building toward a breach ever since. She's not going to the surface. She's going toward the hatchling pen. She's going to her children. The concussions were getting louder. Each one shook dust from the pen ceiling and sent cracks through the older wall plating. Boss's crest was fully raised, glowing hot blue-white, and it had positioned itself between Kale and the wall the sounds were coming through, skull lowered, body braced. The flankers were standing shoulder to shoulder, spines pulsing in a rapid alternation between blue-white and amber that cast strobing shadows across the pen. 7 had pressed itself against Kale's boot, trembling, but when he put his hand on its back the trembling steadied. Not stopped, steadied, because 7 was afraid, but 7 was with its anchor, and that was enough. Vethai's on comms, his voice carrying an edge Kale had never heard. "Warden, the main corridor is compromised. She's through the 3rd barrier. All 3 barriers breached. Nothing between her and the lab complex. I need full sedation teams at Junction 7 now." "Sarath, sedation teams en route. ETA 4 minutes. "Vethais, we don't have 4 minutes, Warden." Kale listened. He did the math. The hatchling pen was 2 junctions past 7. If RC Prime was moving at the speed the vibration suggested, she would reach them in under 3 minutes. The sedation teams would be a minute behind. He opened the pen gate. The hatchlings didn't hesitate. Boss came through first, spines blazing, head low. The flankers fell into position at his sides. 7 scrambled up his back and locked onto his shoulder, and its trembling stopped. In formation, pressed against their anchor, the hatchlings were not afraid. They were alert, focused, vibrating with something deeper than the purr, something older. "With me," Kale said, calm and steady, the same voice he used when he talked about Rain. "We're going to meet her." They walked toward the sound of their mother, tearing through the station. Sarath saw them on the security feed. His crest plates locked flat, and his hands gripped the monitoring console hard enough to bend the frame. He's walking toward her. The human is walking his hatchlings toward a breaching matriarch. Krev was in the monitoring room, watching feeds with an expression that suggested he was reevaluating several life choices. He looked at the feed showing Kale, and the 4 hatchlings moving in formation, calm, precise, the human at center with 7 on his shoulder and Boss clearing the way. "Can you stop him?" Krev asked. "Not without going through the hatchlings," Sarath said. "And the last person who tried that spent 11 hours listening to them scream." Kale found her at Junction 6. RC Prime filled the corridor. She had to crouch to fit, her massive skull lowered, her serrated dorsal crest scraping grooves in the ceiling plating. She was bleeding from her right shoulder where the 3rd barrier had torn her, and her hide, thick as ship armor, dark as volcanic glass, was dusted with basalt fragments. Her eyes were the same burnt copper as RC-12's, the same amber as RC-7's, and they were wide and wild, and full of a fury that Kale recognized, because he'd seen it in every creature he'd ever known that was afraid for something it loved. She wasn't rampaging, she was searching for her clutch. The corridor shook when she saw them. A sound came out of her that rattled the lighting fixtures, cracked the wall plating, and sent a tremor through 3 levels of the station. Not a roar, not a shriek, but something lower than either, something Saith would later identify as a maternal recognition call, a sound that existed below the threshold of hearing, and was felt in the chest and the base of the skull, and the place behind the eyes where instinct lived. The hatchlings answered, all 4, simultaneously, a harmonic that rose to meet their mother's call and locked into it, creating a resonance that made the dust motes dance and the fluorescent panels flicker. Kale felt it in his teeth and in his sternum and in the bones of his hands. He stopped walking, the hatchling stopped with him. Boss was pressed against his right leg. 7's claws were in his shoulder. The flankers were tight on his left, and in front of them, filling the corridor from wall to wall, was 1,200 kilograms of apex predator staring at the small human standing in the middle of her children. Kale met her eyes, burnt copper, enormous. The pupil slits contracted as she focused on him, and behind them was assessment, the hunting intelligence that could track and remember and decide. She was reading him the way she would read terrain, or weather, or threat. He put his hand up, palm flat. The the gesture he used when he wanted the hatchlings to settle. He had no reason to believe it would work on an adult he'd never met. He did it anyway. "Easy," he said. "They're right here, they're all right. Nobody's hurt, they're right here with me." Behind him, on his shoulder, Seven pressed closer. It made the gravel drum sound the purr, the calm sound, the pack sound, and the sound carried down the corridor like an answer to a question RC Prime hadn't known she was asking. RC Prime's nostrils flared. She inhaled a long, deliberate breath that pulled air across the scent receptors in her palate. She was smelling him, smelling her hatchlings on him, the hours of contact, the nutrient slurry on his hands, the dried saliva from Seven's face licking, the shed scales caught in his clothes, the sweat and skin cells, and the unavoidable fact that this human had been living with her children for 5 weeks, and they had chosen to let him. Her dorsal crest fully raised, each serrated spine as long as Kale's forearm, capable of shearing through reinforced plating, lowered, slowly, one blade at a time, folding down against her spine like a weapon being sheathed, until the crest lay flat and her breathing slowed and the wild fury in her eyes went quiet. She lowered her head. It was not submission. Saith would be emphatic about that in her report, underlined twice. Ridge-crests do not submit. What RC Prime did was something outside the existing ethological framework entirely. She extended her recognition to include him. She lowered her head until her snout was level with his chest, and she breathed out a long, warm exhalation that smelled of iron and stone and something older than language, and she was still. Boss moved first. It walked forward out of formation and pressed its head against its mother's jaw. Then the flankers. Then Seven, climbing down from Kale's shoulder and crossing the floor to push itself under the massive curve of RC Prime's skull, making the gravel drum sound, high and clear and young. The maternal recognition call changed. It softened into something rhythmic, synchronized with the hatchling's purring, and for a moment the corridor was filled with a sound like a slow, deep heartbeat shared between 5 ridge crests and one human who stood in the center of it, his hand still raised, palm flat, steady as stone. The sedation teams arrived 45 seconds later. They rounded the corner at Junction 7, weapons up, and stopped. 6 of them, full protective gear. They saw the largest, most dangerous specimen on the station lying in the corridor with her head on the floor, crest flat, 4 hatchlings piled against her jaw. A human standing beside her with his hand resting on the bony ridge above her eye, talking to her, low and steady, about rain. Vethais was with them. He looked at the scene for a long time. Then he lowered his weapon. One by one, 6 weapons came down. "Well," Vethais said, to no one in particular, "all right then." They didn't sedate her. Vethais argued for it. Saith argued against, citing bond disruption risk and RC Prime's stress hormones dropping in real time. Sareth listened to both and then looked at Kale, who was talking to a 1,200-kilogram predator about the color of sunset on Terra Nova, while her eyes were half closed and her breathing was slow and even. "We don't sedate her," Sareth said. "He walks her back." Kale talked her back to her enclosure. He walked beside her through the corridors, one hand on the ridge above her eye, the other hanging at his side where Boss pressed against it. The hatchlings followed in formation around them both, and every handler and biologist and maintenance worker they passed stopped where they were and watched and didn't say a word. The corridors were silent except for RC Prime's breathing, the soft click of her claws on the plating, and the low, steady voice of a human telling her about a place she'd never been, in a language she didn't understand, in a tone that needed no translation. When they reached Enclosure 6, she stepped through the shattered barrier, turned, and lowered her head to him one more time. He touched the ridge above her eye. "I'll bring them to visit," he said. "Every day, I promise." She closed her eyes. The gravel drum sound enormous now, deep enough to vibrate the floor and walls filled the enclosure. A new register, deeper, older, the sound of a matriarch accepting a new member of her line. Sareth met him in the corridor outside Enclosure 6. The warden's crest plates were fully raised. He looked at Kale, at the hatchlings in formation, at 7 tucked against his neck. That was the most dangerous thing I have ever seen anyone do on this station. Yes, sir. If she hadn't recognized you. She did, though. Sareth opened his mouth, closed it, his crest plates lowered slowly. Get back to the pen, Martin. I need to write a report that no one at headquarters is going to believe. Saith intercepted him on the way back, carrying her portable scanner, mandibles clicking like static. She imprinted on you. A wild-caught adult matriarch with no prior human contact performed a recognition extension on a member of another species. It means every paper I've published in the last 11 years is incomplete. She paused. It also means you need to be alive, so perhaps next time you encounter a 1,200-kilogram predator in a corridor, you could consider running. She wasn't going to hurt me. You didn't know that. Kale looked at Boss walking beside him, at 7 on his shoulder, at the flankers tight and calm. Yeah, he said, I did. Saith stared at him. You know what the Veshan word for that is, for knowing something you shouldn't be able to know and being right. No. There isn't one. We don't have the concept. We have data and analysis and probability modeling. We don't have whatever you did in that corridor. Her mandibles clicked once softly. My recommendation is that you're never more than 1 junction away from this pen. Because if our C-prime breaches again and you're not here, people will die. Not the hatchlings, not you, the people between her and you. She went back to her lab. Director Krev was standing in the observation corridor when Kale walked back to the pen. He'd watched the whole thing from the feeds. His adjutants flanked him, data slates dark. He looked at Kale, at the hatchling's spines dark, calm purring, at 7 on his shoulder, at Boss at his feet. How old are you? 22, sir. Krev watched the hatchling settle around the human Boss lowering its head, the flankers closing in, 7 climbing to its perch, and something happened behind his eyes that looked very much like the structural failure of a certainty he'd carried for 40 years. He looked at his data slate. The draft protocol amendment was still there. Saith had written it in the small hours after the screaming started. Sareth had endorsed it at dawn. It had been sitting in Krev's queue for 2 days because he'd intended to delete it. He signed it. He walked to the shuttle bay without another word, and his adjutants followed, and neither of them looked back. Sareth found the signed amendment an hour later. Category 3 Bonded Pack-Anchor Provisions Operational Exemption Framework. Authored by Dr. Saith. Endorsed by Warden Sareth. Signed by Director Krev. Recommended for Accord-wide adoption. The classification it created, Bonded Pack-Anchor, had never existed before. It existed now. Because a 22-year-old human had sat on a floor and let a scared animal bite him, and hadn't flinched. Droost updated Kale's file that afternoon. He changed the job title from Beast Pen Auxiliary Hatchling Division to Bonded Pack-Anchor Ridge-crest Clutch RC791214. It was the longest title in the station's records. He added a note. Previous holders of this position, 0. This is the first. Then he went to the mess hall and ate in silence, and when Torek asked what was wrong, he said, nothing. I just watched a human rewrite our entire species classification framework by sitting on a floor. Torek went to the observation glass that evening. He watched Kale handfeed RC7, the hatchling that had put him in a brace for 3 weeks, and watched the runt take the nutrient gel from the human's fingers with a gentleness Torek had never believed it was capable of. He stood there until his shift started. His crest plates were flat. Dren came too. She watched RC7 curl up on Kale's shoulder. I spent 6 hours backed against a wall because of that animal. I was certain it was going to kill me. It might have, Saith said. And now it sleeps on him like a house pet. Not a pet, A pack member, a pet is owned, a pack member is chosen. Saith's mandibles clicked. RC-7 chose to back you against a wall, it also chose to sleep on his shoulder. The only variable that changed was the human. Vethais was in the corridor outside the pen later that evening, arms crossed, watching through the glass. Kale was inside, asleep on the floor, 4 hatchlings piled on and around him, spines dark, breathing synchronized, the gravel drum purr steady as a pulse. Soreth found him there. 23 years, Vethais said without turning. Apprenticeships, certifications, field rotations on 4 different predator worlds. I have handled more apex specimens than anyone alive in this sector. He paused. His crest plates were half raised and his voice was quiet. And I have never once had a ridge-crest lower its crest for me. He walked away. Kale never knew about that conversation. He was in the pen, on the floor, one hand resting on Seven's warm back, the other draped over Boss's skull plate. The flankers were pressed against his legs. Outside, the Tyvek ridge caught the last light of Kareth's twin suns, and the basalt walls of the station hummed with a sound that might have been the wind, or might have been a 1,200-kilogram matriarch, 3 enclosures away, purring. He was 22 years old. He had no certifications, no training, no credentials, and no intention of going anywhere. The duffel he'd packed during the night of screaming sat unpacked in his barracks bunk, and he hadn't touched it since. He wouldn't. The transfer order that had brought him here said Beast Pen Auxiliary, and the new classification said Bonded Pack Anchor, and neither came close to describing what he actually was, which was something the Veshan had no word for, and the humans had never needed one for, because among humans the concept was so ordinary it didn't require a name. He was theirs. He had a pack, and the pack had him,